The girl lived on the streets with her younger brother until a stranger offered help, but there was a secret that could change everything. The scream echoed through the cold Chicago night, cutting through the air like a sharp blade. Zoe clutched her younger brother Max's arm, pulling him behind a rusty garbage can. Her blue eyes, wide with fear, searched the shadows of the dark alley. "Shh," she whispered, putting a finger over her cracked lips. Max, only 6 years old, trembled against her, his dirty blonde hair falling over his frightened eyes. The sound of heavy footsteps approached. Zoe felt her heart racing, pounding so hard she was sure it would be heard. She held her breath, praying that whoever was approaching would pass straight through. The footsteps stopped. A hoarse voice cut through the silence. "Hey, punks, I know you're there. Get out now." Zoe closed her eyes tightly. She knew that voice. It was Russo, the local drug dealer who controlled the streets on this side of town. He had eyes everywhere and didn't tolerate street children in his territory unless they were working for him. "Max," she whispered, "when I say now, run as fast as you can to the safe house. Don't look back, no matter what happens." The boy nodded, silent tears running down his dirty cheeks. Zoe took a deep breath, gathering all the courage she could. She was all Max had in the world. At 14, she was carrying the weight of being a mother, a father, and a sister, all at the same time. "Now!" she shouted, pushing Max out of hiding. The boy dashed down the street, his bare feet pounding against the cold asphalt. Zoe took off after him, but instead of following her brother, she ran in the opposite direction. "There!" Russo shouted. The sound of heavy footsteps followed her. Zoe ran like never before, her lungs burning, her heart threatening to explode in her chest. She zigzagged through alleyways, jumping fences and dodging obstacles. Her whole body screamed with exhaustion, but fear drove her forward. After what seemed like an eternity, she finally lost her pursuers. Gasping, Zoe leaned against a brick wall, sliding to the ground. Tears of relief and mixed fear streamed down her face. She waited a few minutes to catch her breath before standing up on shaky legs. Now she had to find Max. The way back to the safe house was long and dangerous. Zoe kept to the shadows, avoiding the brightest areas. Her eyes were always alert, looking for any sign of danger. Finally, she reached an abandoned building on the west side of the city. Carefully, Zoe sneaked through a broken window, her movements as silent as a cat's. "Max?" she called softly. "It's me. It's all right now." A muffled sob came from behind a pile of old boxes. Max ran out, throwing himself into his sister's arms. "I thought you weren't coming back," he cried, clinging to her as if his life depended on it. Zoe hugged him tightly, silent tears falling into his dirty hair. "I always come back. Remember? We're a team. I'll never leave you." She pulled away gently, examining her brother's face. "Are you hurt?" Max shook his head. "No. I did as you taught me. I ran fast and didn't look back." "Good boy," Zoe smiled, ruffling his hair. "Now, let's get something to eat. I bet you're starving." She took out of her battered backpack a piece of hard bread and a half-crushed apple that she had gotten earlier. It wasn't much, but it would have to suffice. As they ate in silence, Zoe thought about how things had come to this. Just 6 months ago, they had a home, a family. Now, they were alone, struggling to survive day after day on the unforgiving streets of Chicago. The sudden death of their parents in a car accident had turned their world upside down. With no other relatives to look after them, Zoe and Max ended up in the foster care system. But the thought of being separated was unbearable for Zoe. So, one cold fall night, she grabbed her brother and ran away. Since then, every day has been a struggle. Finding food, a safe place to sleep, avoiding the dangers of the streets, all of this weighed heavily on Zoe's young shoulders. But she was determined to keep Max safe, no matter what the cost. "Zoe," Max's sleepy voice brought her back to the present. "Tell a story." She smiled, pulling him close. "Of course, little one. How about the one about the brave rabbit?" As Zoe told the familiar story, his mind wandered. How much longer could they go on like this? Winter was coming, and with it, new challenges. They needed help, But who could they trust? A noise outside made Zoe stop in mid-sentence. She gently put Max down and stood up, cautiously approaching the window. In the street below, a man was standing under the light of a street lamp. He was looking directly at the building where they were hiding. Zoe's heart raced. Had Russo found them? She prepared to grab Max and run again. But then the man did something unexpected. He left a bag on the floor and slowly walked away, disappearing into the night. Zoe waited for several minutes, watching, hoping it was a trap. When nothing happened, she finally ventured out. The bag contained food, fresh sandwiches, fruit, even some chocolate bars. And at the bottom, there was a note. "I know you're scared. I want to help. I'll be here tomorrow night if you want to talk. Jay." Zoe stared at the note, her heart torn between hope and suspicion. Who was this stranger? Why did he want to help them? As she went back inside with the food, Zoe knew that a crucial decision awaited her. Trusting this stranger could be her salvation or her biggest mistake. What she didn't know was that this decision would trigger a series of events that would change their lives forever. The secret that was about to be revealed would shake the very foundations of the world Zoe thought she knew. While Max slept peacefully, satiated for the first time in weeks, Zoe lay awake, her thoughts a storm of possibilities and fears. Tomorrow night, she would have to make a choice, and that choice would determine not only their future, but also unearth a long-buried past. The morning arrived cold and gray, the Chicago sky covered in heavy clouds that threatened rain. Zoe woke up startled, her body tense after a restless night's sleep. Next to her, Max was still sound asleep, his small body curled up like a protective ball. She got up silently, stretching her aching muscles. The note from the mysterious Jay weighed on her mind like lead. The decision of whether or not to trust this stranger had tormented her all night. "Zoe," Max's sleepy voice snapped her out of her thoughts. "Do you have any more of those sandwiches?" She smiled, stroking her brother's disheveled hair. "Of course, little one. We're making a special breakfast today." As they ate, Zoe watched Max carefully. His eyes, once so lively and bright, now carried a shadow of worry that shouldn't exist in such a young child. She knew she couldn't go on like this. They needed help. But who could they turn to? "Max," she began hesitantly, "what do you think about meeting someone new today?" The boy looked at her curiously. Someone new, like the lady from the library? Zoe smiled as she remembered the kind librarian who sometimes let them stay in the library after closing time. "Not exactly. Remember the food that turned up last night? Someone left it for us. He wants to help us." Max frowned, an expression too serious for his young face. "But you always tell us not to talk to strangers." I know, Zoe sighed. "But sometimes we need to trust a little. Don't worry, I'll make sure we're safe, okay?" The day passed slowly, the anxiety growing in Zoe's chest with each passing hour. They spent the afternoon wandering around the nearby park, Max playing on the swings while Zoe watched him closely, always alert to any sign of danger. As the sun began to set, painting the Chicago sky in shades of orange and pink, Zoe took Max by the hand and started walking back to the abandoned building. Her heart was pounding in her chest, a mixture of fear and hope fighting inside her. As they got closer, Zoe saw a lone figure standing under the same lamppost as the night before. It was a tall, middle-aged man wearing a plain brown coat. His face had worry lines, but his eyes were kind. "Hi," he said softly as they approached. "I'm James. I'm glad you could make it." Zoe shook Max's hand, positioning herself slightly in front of him. "Why do you want to help us?" she asked, her voice firm despite the fear she felt. James smiled sadly. "Because no one should have to go through what you're going through, especially children." He paused, as if carefully choosing his next words. I had a daughter once. She'd be about your age now." Something in his voice, a mixture of pain and sincerity, made Zoe drop her guard a little. "What happened to her?" "An accident, many years ago," James replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Since then, I've been trying to help children in difficult situations. It's It's my way of honoring her memory." Zoe studied James' face, looking for any sign of deception, but all she saw was genuine pain and a sincere desire to help. "What exactly are you offering?" she asked, still cautious. James took a card out of his pocket and handed it to Zoe. "I work with an organization that helps homeless young people. We can offer shelter, food, education, a safe place for you to stay together." Zoe looked at the card in her hand, her heart racing. It was a real chance to get off the streets, to give Max the life he deserved. But years of living on the streets had taught her to always look for the catch. "And what's in it for you?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. James laughed softly. "Honestly, peace of mind. The feeling that I'm doing something good in the world." He knelt down, getting eye level with Max. "And the chance to see children like you smile again." Max, who had been silent until then, stepped forward. "Do you have ice cream there?" James laughed, a genuine, warm sound. "Yes, we have ice cream. Various flavors." Zoe felt a smile form on her lips for the first time in a long time. The idea of a safe place, of not having to constantly worry about their next meal or where they would sleep, was too tempting to ignore. "Okay," she finally said. "Let's give it a chance." The relief on James's face was palpable. "Good. There's a shelter not far from here. We can go now if you want." As they walked through the dark streets of Chicago, Zoe kept Max close, her senses still on high alert. But for the first time in months, she felt a twinge of hope. The shelter was an old but well-kept building. Inside, the warmth and smell of home-cooked food welcomed them. A middle-aged woman with a kind smile came out to greet them. "Welcome," she said. "I'm Carol. We'll get you a room and then you can have something hot to eat." As they followed Carol down the corridor, Zoe couldn't help but notice the other children in the shelter. Some were playing, others reading books. They all seemed safe. Happy, even. The room was small but clean, with 2 beds and a closet. "Home," Max whispered, his eyes shining with excitement. Later, after a hot bath, the first in weeks, and a substantial meal, Zoe lay in the soft bed, watching Max sleep peacefully in the next bed. She knew there was still a long way to go, that life wouldn't be magically perfect from here on in. But for the first time since her parents died, Zoe felt that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. With that comforting thought, she finally allowed herself to relax, letting sleep take her. What Zoe didn't know was that her arrival at the shelter had set in motion a series of events that would soon reveal long-buried secrets. Secrets that connected her past to James in ways she could never have imagined. As the night wore on, the streets of Chicago held their secrets, waiting for the right moment to reveal them. And in the shelter, 2 lost souls began to find their way home, unaware that fate had much bigger plans for them. Dawn brought with it a surreal feeling for Zoe. She woke up disoriented, the comfort of the soft bed feeling strange after months of sleeping on the hard floor. For a moment, panic overwhelmed her. Where was Max? But then the events of the night before came back to her, and she saw her brother still asleep in the next bed, a slight smile on his face. Zoe stood up silently, stretching her muscles. For the first time in a long time, she felt no pain throughout her body. A soft knock on the door made her turn around. "Good morning." Carol, the woman who had welcomed them the night before, smiled kindly. "I hope you slept well. Breakfast is being served, if you're hungry." The cafeteria was a cozy space, full of round tables where other children and teenagers were already eating and chatting. Zoe guided Max, still sleepy, to an empty table, her eyes constantly scanning the room, old habits hard to break. "Hey, you're the new guys, right?" An excited voice surprised them. A girl of about 12, curly hair tied up in a ponytail, smiled at them. "I'm Lily. Can I sit with you?" Zoe hesitated for a moment, but Lily's genuine smile made her relax a little. "Of course," she replied. "I'm Zoe, and this is my brother, Max." As they ate, Lily talked animatedly about the shelter, the activities available, the classes on offer. Zoe listened carefully, absorbing every piece of information, always on the lookout for any sign of danger or deception. But everything seemed normal, safe. "And you'll love Mr. James," Lily continued. "He always brings the best books and sometimes takes us for walks in the park." Hearing James' name, Zoe felt a pang of curiosity. "How well do you know him?" Lily nodded enthusiastically. "He comes here almost every day. He always has time to chat or help with homework. He's like a father to all of us." Lily's words echoed in Zoe's mind for the rest of the morning. As she and Max were introduced to the routine of the shelter, classes in the morning, recreational activities in the afternoon, Zoe couldn't stop thinking about James and his motivation to help them. It was in the middle of the afternoon that Zoe saw him again. James was in the courtyard, helping some younger children plant flowers in small pots. There was something about the scene, the kindness in his eyes, the patience in his instructions, that made Zoe's heart squeeze. "Zoe!" James saw her and waved, a warm smile on his face. "How are you settling in?" She approached cautiously. Everything's fine. Max seems happy." James nodded, his gaze softening. "And you? How are you feeling?" The question took Zoe by surprise. How long had it been since someone had cared how she felt? "I don't know," she admitted. "It's strange not having to worry all the time." "I understand," James said softly. "It takes time to feel safe again. But you're safe here, Zoe. I promise." Something in his voice, in the sincerity of his words, made Zoe want to believe. But years on the streets had taught her that trust was a dangerous luxury. "Why are you really helping us?" she asked abruptly. "And don't tell me it's just because of your daughter. There has to be more." James was silent for a moment, his eyes lost on some distant point. When he spoke again, his voice was charged with emotion. "You're right. There is more." He paused, as if carefully choosing his next words. "Zoe, what do you remember about your parents?" The question caught her off guard. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Please," James insisted gently. "It's important." Zoe frowned, long suppressed memories coming to the surface. "Not much. They died in a car accident when I was 8. Max was just a baby." She swallowed, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. "Why are you asking me this?" James took a deep breath. "Because I knew your parents, Zoe. In fact, I was very close to them." The world seemed to spin around Zoe. "What? How is that possible?" "Your father and I were partners," James explained, his voice low. "Not in the police, as you might think, but in something different, something that put them in danger." Zoe took a step back, her mind in turmoil. "No, I don't understand. What kind of danger? And if you knew them, why didn't you come to us before?" "I did," James said, the pain evident in his voice. "But when I arrived, you had already disappeared from the system. I spent years trying to find you." The sound of children's laughter in the distance seemed surreal against the gravity of the conversation. Zoe felt as if the ground was disappearing beneath her feet. What exactly did my parents do? And why did that put them in danger? James looked around, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. "Not here," he said quietly. "Tonight, after the children are asleep. There's a lot you need to know, Zoe. About your parents, about the past, and about the danger that could still be out there." With those words, James walked away, leaving Zoe standing in the middle of the courtyard, her mind a storm of unanswered questions. The world she thought she knew was crumbling around her, and she had no idea what she would find amidst the rubble. As the sun began to set over Chicago, casting long shadows across the shelter's courtyard, Zoe watched Max playing with other children. His carefree laughter was a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Night was approaching, and with it, the promise of answers. But Zoe wasn't sure she was ready for what was to come. The past she had buried so deep was about to resurface, and she feared that the revelations could change everything, not only her future, but also her memories of her parents. With a heavy heart and a restless mind, Zoe prepared herself for a night that promised to be the turning point in her young life. Whatever James had to reveal, she knew that nothing would be the same after that. Night fell over Chicago like a heavy cloak, bringing with it an eerie stillness. Zoe stayed awake, sitting on the edge of her bed, watching Max sleep peacefully. Each passing minute seemed to drag by, burdened with the weight of anticipation. When the clock finally struck midnight, Zoe quietly got up. She smoothed the blanket over Max, planted a soft kiss on his forehead, and, with one last worried look, left the room. The corridor was deserted, lit only by the dim light of the emergency lamps. Zoe walked with silent steps to the common room, where James was waiting for her. He was sitting in a worn armchair, his face a mask of concern and determination. "Zoe," he said softly when he saw her enter. "Thank you for coming." She sat facing him, her body tense, ready to flee at any sign of danger. "I'm here. Now tell me the truth. All of it." James nodded, taking a deep breath before beginning. "Your parents, Michael and Sarah, weren't ordinary people. Zoe, they were secret agents, part of a government organization so secret that few know of its existence." Zoe felt as if the air had been knocked out of her lungs. "Secret agents? That's crazy." "I know it sounds like it, but it's the truth," James continued. "I was an agent too. Your father and I were partners. We worked on high-priority cases, things that could change the course of history." Zoe's hands were shaking, her mind struggling to process the information. "If that's true, why didn't they ever tell us? Why live a normal life?" James smiled sadly. "To protect you. The less you knew, the safer you'd be. At least, that's what we thought." "The car accident," Zoe muttered, a terrible realization beginning to form. "It wasn't an accident, was it?" James shook his head slowly. "No, it wasn't. Your parents were investigating an extremely dangerous criminal organization. They discovered something big. But before they could report it, they were murdered," Zoe added, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," James confirmed, the pain evident in his voice. "I was supposed to be with them that night, but I was called away on another mission at the last minute. When I found out what had happened, it was too late." Zoe stood up abruptly, unable to sit still. She walked over to the window, looking out at the sleeping city. "Why are you telling me this now? After all these years?" James joined her at the window. "Because the danger isn't over, Zoe. The organization your parents were investigating still exists, and there's reason to believe that they might be after you." The icy fear that Zoe knew so well from the streets returned in full force. "Why? What do Max and I have to do with it?" "Your parents hid crucial information before they died," James explained. "Information that could bring down the entire organization. And there's reason to believe that you, without knowing it, could have access to that information." Zoe turned to face him, her eyes burning with a mixture of anger and fear. "So that's why you helped us? To use us as bait?" "No," James exclaimed, looking genuinely hurt by the accusation. "I spent years looking for you, Zoe, to protect you, to keep the promise I made to your parents." He pulled something out of his pocket, a chain with a small pendant. "Your mother gave me this the last time we met. She said that one day I would understand its meaning." Zoe took the pendant with trembling hands. It was a simple silver disc, with a strange pattern engraved on its surface. Something about it seemed strangely familiar. "What does it mean?" she asked. "I'm not sure," James admitted, "but I believe it's a key to the information your parents hid." Zoe closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the pendant in her hand. It was as if the past and the present were colliding, rewriting everything she thought she knew about her life. "What happens now?" she asked, opening her eyes to face James. "Now," he said with fierce determination, "we keep you and Max safe, and we try to find out what your parents have discovered. It's the only way to end this once and for all." Zoe looked again at the city outside, the distant lights twinkling like earthly stars. Her mind was in a whirl, processing everything she had learned. Her parents, people she could barely remember now, had been secret heroes. And now, somehow, it was up to her to continue their legacy. "I need to tell Max," she finally said. James put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We'll tell him together, in the morning. For now, try to rest. The next few days will be difficult." As Zoe walked back to her room, she felt as if she were walking in a dream. The pendant in her hand seemed to pulsate with undisclosed secrets. Lying on her bed, unable to sleep, Zoe looked at Max, her little brother, so innocent, so oblivious to the danger that surrounded them. She made a silent promise to him and to the parents she had barely known. She would find out the truth, no matter what the cost. Dawn found Zoe still awake, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. The city outside was beginning to wake up, unaware of the drama unfolding within the shelter's walls. A new day was beginning, bringing with it the promise of more revelations and, perhaps, more danger. But for the first time in a long time, Zoe was not alone. With James by her side and the memory of her parents guiding her, she was ready to face whatever the future held. The journey to unravel the mystery had only just begun. The sun had barely risen when Zoe felt a gentle hand on her shoulder. She hadn't slept, her eyes burning with tiredness and her mind filled with turbulent thoughts. James stood beside her bed, his face a mixture of concern and determination. "It's time," he said softly. Zoe nodded, slowly sitting up. She looked at Max, still sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the revelations to come. With a heavy sigh, she gently woke him up. "Max, darling, wake up. We have something important to talk about." Max's sleepy eyes opened, confused at first, but quickly filled with curiosity at seeing James there. "What's going on, Zoe?" Over the next few minutes, in a shaky but determined voice, Zoe told Max a simplified version of what she had learned. James intervened occasionally, offering details or clarifications. Max listened in silence, his eyes wide with surprise and, at times, fear. "So, our parents were sort of secret superheroes?" Max finally asked, his voice a mixture of admiration and sadness. Zoe smiled sadly, pulling him into a hug. "Yeah, I guess we could say that." James knelt down in front of them, his face serious. "Max, Zoe, I know this is a lot to process, but we need to act fast. It's not safe for us to stay here much longer." As if to emphasize his words, a sudden bang echoed down the corridor, followed by screams and the sound of breaking glass. James became instantly alert, his body tensing like a spring. "They've found us," he muttered, his face pale. "Quickly, take only the essentials. We have to get out of here now." Chaos ensued in the shelter. Children screaming, staff trying to keep order, and in the middle of it all, Zoe, Max, and James running down the corridors. Zoe clutched Max's hand tightly, her heart beating frantically. They reached the back of the building, where a van was waiting for them. Carol, the shelter's kind supervisor, was at the wheel, her face a mask of determination. "Get in!" she shouted, starting the engine. As the van sped through the streets of Chicago, Zoe looked out of the back window. Men dressed in black were storming the shelter, their weapons glinting in the morning sun. The reality of the situation hit her full force. "Where are we going?" Max asked, his voice trembling with fear. James turned around in the front seat, his face grave. "Somewhere safe. A hideout that your parents prepared years ago, in case something like this happened." Zoe held the pendant James had given her, feeling its weight against her palm. "What about that? What does that have to do with anything?" "I believe it's the key to the safe house," James explained, "and possibly to the information your parents discovered." The van snaked through the city streets, Carol driving with surprising skill, avoiding possible pursuers. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached the outskirts of Chicago, entering a wooded area. Carol stopped the van in front of an apparently abandoned cabin. "This is it," she said. "Quick, get in. I'll lose anyone who might be following us." As Carol drove away, James guided Zoe and Max into the hut. The interior was surprisingly modern, with high-tech equipment hidden behind a rustic facade. "Wow," Max whispered, his eyes wide with admiration. James moved quickly, activating security systems and checking monitors. "We're safe for now," he finally said, relaxing a little. "But not for long. We need to find out what your parents knew." Zoe took the pendant off her neck, examining it carefully. "How does this work?" James took the pendant, turning it in his hands. "There must be some kind of mechanism." He stopped abruptly, his eyes lighting up. "Wait, that reminds me of something your father used to say." He turned to Zoe and Max. "Do you remember any phrases or sayings that your parents used to repeat? Something that didn't seem to make sense at the time?" Zoe frowned, searching through her hazy memories. It was Max who spoke first. "The key is in the heart," he said softly. "Mom used to say that when she put us to sleep." James smiled, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Of course. Michael has always been fascinated by riddles." He examined the pendant again, pressing it at various points. With a soft click, the center of the disc opened, revealing a small compartment. Inside was a tiny computer chip. James inserted it into one of the cabin's computers, and immediately the screen filled up with codes and documents. "Here it is," James muttered, his eyes running across the screen. "Everything your parents found out about the organization. Names, dates, operations, that's all we need to bring them down." Zoe and Max approached, staring at the screen with a mixture of admiration and sadness. There was their parents' legacy, the reason they had given their lives. "What do we do now?" Zoe asked, her voice firm despite the fear she still felt. James turned to them, his face serious but determined. "Now, we finish what your parents started. We're going to expose this organization and make sure you're safe once and for all." As the sun rose in the sky, illuminating the clearing around the hut, Zoe felt a wave of emotions wash over her. Fear, sadness, pride, determination. She looked at Max, seeing the same mixture of emotions in his eyes. They were more than just two orphaned brothers now. They were the keepers of a secret that could change the world. And with James by their side, they were ready to face whatever came next. The distant sound of helicopters broke the silence of the forest. The battle was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. But for the first time since her parents died, Zoe felt she had a purpose, a mission. With one last look at the screen full of secrets, Zoe made a silent promise to her parents. She would finish what they had started, no matter the cost. The truth would be revealed, and justice would be served. The next phase of her journey was about to begin, and Zoe was ready to face it head-on. The sound of the helicopters grew louder by the second, echoing through the forest surrounding the cabin. James moved quickly, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he downloaded the information from the chip onto a handheld device. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice tense. "They must have traced the signal when we activated the chip." Zoe felt the familiar fear tighten in her chest, but this time there was something different, a fierce determination that overcame the panic. She looked at Max, seeing the same thing in his eyes. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice firm. James finished downloading the data and switched off the computers. "We have to split up," he said, picking up a backpack hidden under a loose floorboard. "It's the only way to keep the information safe." He took 3 small devices out of the backpack, handing one to Zoe and one to Max. "These are emergency transmitters. If any of us are captured, we can activate the signal to let the others know." "Captured?" Max asked, his voice trembling slightly. James knelt down in front of him, putting his hands on his shoulders. "Max, I know you're scared, but you're stronger than you think. You're Michael and Sarah's son, remember? The blood of heroes runs through your veins." Max straightened his shoulders, nodding with determination. Zoe felt a surge of pride for her little brother. "What's the plan?" she asked. James opened a map on the table. "We'll split up into 3 directions. I'll go north, towards Canada. Zoe, you'll go west, towards Seattle, and Max." "Can I go alone?" Max interrupted, his eyes wide. Zoe started to protest, but James interrupted her with a look. "Max will go south, towards St. Louis. He'll have the help of an old friend of mine who lives there." Zoe felt her heart squeeze at the thought of being separated from Max. But she knew James was right. Together, they would be an easy target. "How will we know where to go after that?" she asked. James smiled, a glint of pride in his eyes. "Your parents left clues. Each of you has a piece of the puzzle. When it's safe, use the transmitters to find each other and put the pieces together." The sound of helicopters was almost upon them now. James guided them to a hidden hatch in the floor of the hut. "This tunnel will take you to different exits in the forest," he explained. "Remember, trust each other, trust yourself, and never give up." Zoe hugged Max tightly, silent tears streaming down her face. "Stay safe, little one," she whispered. "We'll meet again soon." Max hugged her back, his voice determined despite the tears in his eyes. "I promise, Zoe, I'll make Mom and Dad proud." With one last look at James, the siblings split up, each heading down a different tunnel. Zoe ran through the dark passage, her heart pounding in her ears. When she finally emerged into the forest, the sound of voices and barking dogs filled the air. Without looking back, she ran, letting her street instincts guide her steps. Hours passed in a frantic race through the forest. Zoe used all the skills she had learned on the streets of Chicago to avoid her pursuers. When she finally reached a small town, she was exhausted, dirty, and hungry. Using the money James had put in her backpack, Zoe bought a bus ticket to the west. While waiting at the station, her gaze fell on a television in the diner next door. The news showed images of the shelter in Chicago, now surrounded by police and federal agents. "An anti-terrorism operation has left the youth shelter in ruins," the reporter said. "Authorities are searching for 2 teenagers considered persons of interest." Zoe felt her blood run cold as she saw her and Max's photos on the screen. They were fugitives now, hunted not only by the real villains, but also by those who were supposed to protect them. When the bus finally left, taking her west and into an uncertain future, Zoe allowed herself a moment of weakness. Silent tears streamed down her face as she thought of Max, of James, of the parents she had barely known. But then she dried her tears with determination. There was no time to cry now. She had a mission to accomplish, a legacy to honor. As the bus drove through the night, Zoe looked out of the window at the stars in the sky. Somewhere out there, Max and James were making their own journeys. And somewhere, waiting to be discovered, was the truth that her parents had died to protect. Zoe squeezed the transmitter in her pocket. It was more than a communication device now. It was a promise, a link to the only people in the world she could trust. With this comforting thought, Zoe finally allowed tiredness to overcome her. She fell asleep, lulled by the movement of the bus, dreaming of a future where her family would be reunited again and the truth would finally come out. But even in her dreams, a part of her remained alert. For the journey was far from over, and the dangers that awaited them were greater than anything she had ever faced. The dawn would bring new challenges, new clues to decipher, and Zoe would be ready to face them, one step at a time, until she could finally fulfill the promise she had made to herself, to Max, and to the memory of her parents. The truth would be revealed, no matter what the cost. The sun was setting over Seattle when Zoe finally arrived in the city. 3 months had passed since that fateful night in the cabin, 3 months of constant running, of looking over her shoulder at every corner, of deciphering clues left by her parents. Zoe was different now. Her once long hair was short and dyed red. Her once innocent eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen too much in so little time. But in his heart, the flame of determination burned stronger than ever. The transmitter in her pocket vibrated softly. It was the signal she had been waiting for weeks. Max and James had arrived in town. It was time for the final meeting. With cautious steps, Zoe made her way to the agreed location, an old lighthouse on the coast. Her heart was pounding, a mixture of anxiety and hope. When she finally spotted 2 familiar figures in the distance, tears of relief welled up in her eyes. "Max!" she shouted, running towards her brother. The 2 hugged each other tightly, words failing them in the emotion of the moment. James joined them, his face showing signs of tiredness, but his eyes shining with determination. "We did it," he said simply. "We're all here." Inside the abandoned lighthouse, The three shared their journeys. Max talked about the skills he had developed, about how James' friend had trained him in cryptography and evasion techniques. Zoe told him about the clues she had followed, the dangers she had faced. James listened intently, a proud smile on his face. "You are truly your parents' children," he said. "Now, it's time to put the final pieces of the puzzle together." They spread their findings out on an old table. Documents, photos, pieces of code, each item a piece of the complex puzzle that Michael and Sarah had left behind. As they worked to decipher the final message, Zoe couldn't help thinking about how their lives had changed. Just a few months ago, she and Max were struggling to survive on the streets of Chicago. Now, they were about to expose a conspiracy that would shake the foundations of the government. The hours passed in a blur of discoveries and revelations. As the sun rose, illuminating the lighthouse with its golden light, the truth finally came out. "That's it," James said, his voice charged with emotion. "We've got everything. Names, dates, operations, enough evidence to bring down the entire organization." Zoe looked at the laptop screen, where all the data had been compiled. "What do we do now?" James smiled, a glint of triumph in his eyes. "Now, we do what your parents always wanted. We expose the truth to the world." With the click of a button, the information was sent to trusted journalists, independent news agencies, and social media platforms around the world. In a matter of minutes, the internet exploded with the revelations. Zoe, Max, and James watched in fascination as the truth spread like wildfire. Powerful politicians were exposed, secret operations came to light, and the criminal organization that had taken Michael and Sarah's lives began to crumble. As chaos ensued in the outside world, Zoe turned to Max and James. "What now? What happens to us?" James put a hand on each of their shoulders. "Now, you have a choice to make. You can take on new identities, start a new life away from it all. Or we can continue our parents' work," Max added, his eyes shining with determination. Zoe looked at her brother, seeing in him no longer the frightened boy she had protected for so long, but a strong and courageous young man. She then looked at James, the man who had risked everything to keep them safe and help them discover the truth. With a smile, she made her decision. "I think we already know the answer," she said. "We are Michael and Sarah's children. We have a legacy to honor." James nodded, pride evident on his face. "Then it's decided. From now on, you are no longer just Zoe and Max. You are the new guardians of the truth." As the sun rose in the sky, bathing Seattle in a golden light, Zoe felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced for years. The road ahead would be difficult, full of challenges and dangers, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. They had each other. They had the truth by their side, and they had the memory of Michael and Sarah to guide them. Zoe looked at the horizon, where the ocean met the sky. A new day was dawning, not just for them, but for the whole world. A day of truth, of justice, of redemption. And they would be there to see this new world born, ready to face any challenge that came their way. Together, as a family, as heroes, Michael and Sarah's legacy lived on through them. And now, it was time to write the next chapter of their story.
Did this narrative stir your emotions? Don't forget to express your approval with a like. Take advantage of the Super Thanks feature, available just below the video, to offer direct support to the channel and contribute to the production of more fascinating content. Subscribe and remember to activate the bell to stay up to date with all the latest updates. And attention, a new exciting story is already ready to be displayed on your screen. Your participation means a lot to me, and I hope to count on your presence soon. Thank you very much for dedicating your time to this video.